Hi, everybody. My name is Patty, and I run public programs here at California Historical Society. And we're very excited to welcome all of you here for this really powerful event. It's both a book launch for Ivy and Devin, but also, very central to our mission, which is making history a relevant part of our contemporary lives. So we hope you enjoy it. I'm going to do the introductions for each of the speakers, and I'm going to speak very slowly, and I may look down at my piece of paper a little bit. So bear with me. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the structure of the program as well, so you guys feel really empowered and prepared for sort of what's coming next. You guys have also noticed that there's index cards and little golf pencils on your chairs. That's for the Q&A portion. That's to make sure that everybody gets to ask the question they would like to. When you are ready with the question during that section, just raise it in the air, and then I will grab it, or one of my volunteers will grab it. So as the presentations are coming, just think about your questions and direct them to whoever you find you would like to have a question answered by. So anyway, how many of you guys have been here before? Raise your hand. Wow, well, welcome back, and welcome to all the new people here. We're so happy to have you all, so welcome. So I'm going to do the bios now. So Ivy Anderson is a San Francisco-based writer who focuses on the issues of ecology and radical history. Her reportage on water management issues was published in the Water Efficiency magazine, and her poetry in Poecology? Cool, okay. She holds a BA in environmental studies and a minor in geography, runs a community garden, is on the board of a bookstore collective in San Francisco. Devin Angus, who is on her left, yes, is an artist, activist, and historian based in San Francisco. He actually composed and performed a conceptual folk operetta based on San Francisco history. So cool. The Ghosts of Barbary, throughout the Bay Area, Switzerland, and Italy. He organized and published a series of oral histories of immigrants in the Catskills region, and was the recipient of an arts grant through the New York State Council of the Arts for his show, Songs and Stories of Old New York. To read more about their work, visit their blog, which I didn't put the link in my bio section, but they will talk about. But I think is it Voices from the Underworld. So check it out. They have great pieces written about this history. So if you want to dive in more deeply and explore beyond the book, please go for that. Rachel Rust founded the U.S. Prostitutes Collective, or U.S. Pros, in San Francisco in 1981. Which is an organization of women of sex workers and ex-sex workers. U.S. Pros has a particular focus on women who are in the most dire situations and are the most vulnerable to violence. Women who work the streets, young women, women of color, and or immigrant women, the majority of whom are mothers supporting families. Rachel was on the SF Task Force on Prostitution, campaigns for decriminalization of prostitution, for justice, protection, and resources, so no woman, young person, or man is forced into prostitution through poverty. Rita Wong is an erotic service provider. More specifically, she has been a prostitute for about 14 years. As a rank-and-file member of the Erotic Service Providers Union, she is active in the union because she wants the rights to negotiate her own safe working conditions. Under current law, prostitution is criminal. Workers and their clients do not have equal protection under the law. Rita is also a board member of the ESPLERP. The group is challenging the prostitution law in federal court on the basis that it violates the U.S. Constitution. Sophia Amelia is a sacred courtesan who leads with her heart. One of the most top-rated escorts in the SFB area, she has attained that status by practicing heart-open, connected sex work. Sophia is also a certified intimacy and relationship coach and is a lifelong student of philosophies and spirit systems around the world. Some of her specialties include healing from childhood sexual trauma, navigating major life transitions, releasing from shame, and spreading love widely, authentically, and without discrimination. For the past 2 years, Sophia has been working as a sex worker rights activist, fighting alongside veteran activists for the full decriminalization of prostitution. She is a member of SWAP Bay Area and the Erotic Service Providers Union. I cannot tell you how happy I am to be working with all of you. It's been such a pleasure. You are all amazing. You are all amazing. I'm going to hand it over to Gail from Heyday to do our welcome from them, and then we are going to get started. So thank you.
Hello, thank you all for coming out. I'll keep this quick so we can get on with this exciting program. As Patty might have told you, this is the third California Historical Society Book Award winner, co-published by CHS and by Heyday. We're a 42-year-old nonprofit publisher out of Berkeley, California. We're proud to call our books boundary breaking, and we're very grateful for the longtime support, encouragement, and dare I say, enablement of California Historical Society, the longtime arbiter of our state's history. We're both nonprofits, and we're very grateful for your engagement, your attendance, and your financial support of publications like this and of events like this. Thank you very much to CHS for hosting tonight, Patty especially, and especially for taking this occasion for celebration and turning it into a thought-provoking conversation. My warm thanks to Erotic Service Union for participating as well. Congratulations, big congratulations to Ivy and Devin. When we saw this submission in our submissions pile, we all knew we had something very special in front of us, but I'm going to let tonight's program show you why. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for those warm welcomes. I think, first of all, we want to extend our own gratitude to each one of you in the audience today for braving what we all thought was going to be rain to visit us. We also just want to say thank you with such expressive ebullience to Heyday and the California Historical Society. Truly, you both believed in this project in one of its very earliest forms, and obviously we wouldn't be here without you today. Finally, also we want to thank the Erotic Service Providers Union and the U.S. Prostitutes Collective for being here as our co-presenters today. We hope that it will help remind every one of us here why it is that this work from 1913 that we'll be talking about is still relevant. We've prepared this presentation today and really look forward to all of your questions. It was a little over 4 years ago that Devin and I, holed up behind a microfiche reader at the San Francisco Public Library, stumbled upon the memoir of Alice Smith, published in 1913 by the San Francisco Bulletin and entitled A Voice from the Underworld. At the time, we knew very little about this memoir. What we did know is that it was published by Fremont Older, who had began his campaign as a newspaper editor, as a vitriolic crusader, but who later had a turn, a philosophical change, and became an empathetic warrior for social justice here in San Francisco. We also knew that later biographers and Fremont Older himself attributed his publication of A Voice from the Underworld to a later sex workers' march that was organized in 1917. But what we didn't know was anything about who Alice Smith was. Who was this woman? Why did she write her memoir? And why did the Bulletin decide to publish it? Was her story meant to inspire fear, titillation, pity, or perhaps compassion? And did Alice Smith even exist? Or was this just some political maneuver by the paper to increase their sales and engage in this so-called white slavery debate that had taken the nation's media by storm? And why was it, finally, that the Bulletin chose to publish nearly 300 letters written by other sex workers and working-class women from the time? Over the course of our research, we paid attention to today's newspapers and to the changing face of San Francisco amidst the second coming of the tech industry. We witnessed the shuttering and attempted cleanup of many of the city's centers of vice. The Tenderloin, as you may know, now being rebranded as Union Square West. The naked men of the Castro famously have to cover their bits now.
With decency sheaths.
Yeah, decency sheaths. And, pot-smoking street kids on Haight Street are being arrested for sitting on the sidewalks. We watched many of our own working-class friends get pushed out of the city as we worked on this project and faced our own eviction troubles. As San Francisco changed before our eyes, we cannot help but recall our research and notice many similarities to our own time. The post-earthquake boosterism of real estate in 1906, the cleanup efforts before the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition, and the eventual closure of the dance halls, brothels, and gambling dens of the Barbary Coast in 1917 all suddenly sounded so familiar. We also noticed a burgeoning discussion about feminism, sex work, and sex workers' rights that was happening on a global scale. In 2015, Amnesty International published a controversial policy goal to decriminalize consensual sex work worldwide. The policy spurred a media blitz, and suddenly op-eds written by current and former sex workers were appearing in the New York Times, The Guardian UK, The Washington Post, and other enormous publications. We could not help but notice a number of striking similarities to A Voice from the Underworld. In 1913 and today, politicians, religious groups, anti-trafficking activists, celebrities, and feminists have all had an enormous hand in shaping how we think about sex work. But how many of us have actually heard from the sex workers themselves? Both in the bulletin in 1913 and today, sex workers are demanding to be heard, to be taken seriously, and to be given agency over their own lives. And it seems that in 1913, Fremont Older genuinely attempted to help by opening the pages of his daily paper to the public as a forum for equitable debate. And for once, the opinions of prostitutes were published alongside those of the city's politicians, society women, and clergy. So today we're going to tell you a little bit more about A Voice from the Underworld, how it came to be, and what we think it meant for this city in flux. And we hope that each of you are able to quiet your own preconceived notions about sex work for the next hour. We also hope you come away with a bit more understanding about this city and the constant struggle to define its identity. Is San Francisco a sanctuary for social leniency and justice? Is it an imperial center of global wealth and power? This debate goes all the way back to the gold rush, and unsurprisingly, so do we.
The story behind A Voice from the Underworld begins with two newspaper editors, James King of William and Fremont Older. The first, James King of William, was a vigilante newspaperman who hoped to clean up the shantytown metropolis of San Francisco during the tumultuous era of the 1850s. His paper, the San Francisco Evening Bulletin, was his platform, where, according to one historian, he flayed the politicians, the prostitutes, the gamblers, the toughs, the police, and just about everything in sight while championing the home, the church, the school, and reform. Gold Rush San Francisco, due to its geographic isolation, held in its infancy a very relaxed sense of morals. Gambling and prostitution was widespread and accepted. In a city where men outnumbered women 50 to 1 in 1849, prostitutes served to fill an important social function. Now, throughout the nation, concepts of gender were considered by these terms that are usually called in academia, these Jacksonian-era gender roles, had a place where men were considered by nature authoritative and passionate to a fault, and they controlled the public sphere of politics and economics, while women, who were considered by nature to be asexual, were the moral guardians of the home, the hearth, the family. And within a public city like San Francisco, the concepts of the country were that these two genders needed to actually work together to have a proper society. Now, when you have a 50 to 1 gender imbalance in San Francisco, there was a problem with this. There were a lot of prostitutes in San Francisco and no so-called decent women. So without proper women in San Francisco, prostitutes stepped in to serve this role of the public stage, and for a few years amassed a level of respectability. Though this wasn't across the board, women of color had a much steeper slope to climb. All of this changed as so-called proper women began to displace the gender imbalance of Gold Rush San Francisco. Prostitution was driven to segregated districts, such as the Barbary Coast, where they could fulfill their new role as a necessary evil, a release valve that would channel men's uncontrollable lusts, as they're considered within this Jacksonian gender role, away from so-called proper women. Though wealthy madams could and would retain some of this earlier respectability, prostitutes, for the most part, were relegated now to the underground, as they called it, as pariahs, social pariahs. James King of William, the crusading editor who sought to clean up the city, was gunned down in 1856. As a side note, it's very dangerous to be a newspaper editor in San Francisco historically. It's remarkable how many of them have been killed. Fremont Older himself had at least 3 attempts on his life, and in his archives, you can see frightening letters that kind of look like the Zodiac Killer are writing to him. His death, James King of William, helped spark the infamous Vigilance Committee of 1856, which resulted in public lynchings and open insurrections in the name of law and order. Vice and civic corruption would go hand in glove in the minds of future reformers and vigilantes, including Fremont Older, who took over the reins of the Bulletin in 1895. Though Fremont Older would, in turn, become a champion of the disenfranchised, it would take him some time. Early in his career, he proudly steered the Bulletin as a weapon of vigilantism, following the footsteps of his predecessor, James King of William. He sought to rid San Francisco of the corrosive element of graft in city government, which was widespread, an institution he believed was wrapped up in the vice dens of Chinatown and the Barbary Coast. Widespread bribery was, for Older, an aspect of the old gold rush city days that had survived for long enough. He attacked the corruptors as he saw them with a religious fervor. No one suffered the brunt of this attack more than the political boss of the Union Labor Party, Abraham Roof, who rose to power behind Mayor Schmitz in 1902. This is the famous graft trials of this decade for you history buffs. The publication of Alice Smith's memoirs were the direct result of this complicated relationship. The corrupt political boss and the overzealous editor clashed throughout the first decade of the 1900s, with Roof eventually being sent to San Quentin. Fremont Older, having cracks of doubt about this crusade he had against the political boss, visited Abe Roof in prison. The editor, by 1910, had begun to seriously doubt his crusade, especially considering that the political boss was the only one behind bars, despite widespread bribes being handed out by the business elite of the city. Furthermore, the conditions of San Quentin horrified Fremont Older, who shocked the city by, the next day after he visited him, calling for his release. He spent 10 years trying to put this man in prison. Then he called for his release, and historians still have a hard time wrapping their mind around why he did this. But we're going to try to explain it, and it's also very much wrapped up in the publication of A Voice from the Underworld. Fremont Older, defending himself, in a speech in 1910, explained why he had such a dramatic reversal. It is here that Older shows a remarkable turn away from what he considered his role as a vigilante. He was a crusading prosecutor, to use kind of these lawyer terms, and instead he wanted to move towards being a public defender for the voiceless in society. And this is around 1910 that he began doing this. This is what he said about Roof. "I have asked for mercy to Roof because I felt that I, above all others, had done the most to bring about his downfall. At last, after 8 years of a man-hunting and man-hating debauch, Roof crossed over and became what I wanted him to be, a convict, stripped of his citizenship, stripped of everything society values except the remnant of an ill-gotten fame and fortune. It is then that I said to myself, I have got him. He is in stripes. He is in a cell. His head is shaved. He is in tears. He is helpless, beaten, chained, killed. So far as his old life is concerned, you have won. How do you like your victory? My soul revolted. I saw myself also stripped, that is, stripped of all pretense, sham, self-righteousness, holding the key to another man's cell. I dropped the key. I never want to hold it again. Let it be taken up and held by those who feel they are justified in holding it. I want no more jail keys." Fremont Older decided to give Abraham Roof a platform from which he could defend himself and proposed that the fallen political boss publish his memoirs in the Bulletin. The resulting memoir, called The Road I Traveled, was serialized for 3 months in 1911. That same year, Older, who had been spending more and more time with prisoners at San Quentin, had a very important meeting with a man named Donald Lowry, who would become a protege and something like a son to Fremont Older. Lowry had been writing his memoirs in San Quentin, which talked about the rampant, horrible prison abuse and torture that were going on in the California prisons. He would have been sent back to prison had it been found out that he was writing this memoir. Older, who still had a lot of political connections, secured an early parole for Donald Lowry, and the two men began to create a network of safety nets to help ex-convicts once they were released from prison. Following the success of Abe Roof's memoirs, Older convinced Lowry to publish his convict memoir as a serial in the Bulletin in 1912, 1 year before Alice Smith's memoirs would be published. Thus began a new chapter in the history of the Bulletin. The crusading editor, hoping to atone for the vigilantism of his paper's past, turned towards the experiment, using the format of the serialized memoir as a tool of social justice while giving a voice to those marginalized by society.
We're both big fans of Fremont Older and became big friends of his over the course of this research because this sort of existential turnabout he had is so fascinating. By the time Fremont Older prepared to publish Alice Smith's story, women had entered a whole new political era in San Francisco. In 1911, California voters had narrowly approved a suffrage bill, making the state one of the first to allow women the vote 9 years before the 19th Amendment was passed nationwide. The enfranchisement of women in California indicates a major shift in how gender roles were defined. These Jacksonian and Victorian standards that we were talking about before had prevailed in San Francisco and beyond for decades. Women, once again, considered to be by nature moral, spiritual, and sexless. Their demure and righteous force was considered necessary to counterbalance these masculine tendencies towards brutishness, violence, and promiscuity, but only within the privacy of the home. These masculine qualities were considered necessary for navigating the sphere of politics, a world considered far too coarse for the gentle sensibilities of the feminine class. It's no coincidence that suffrage movements arose in the US's major cities at the same time that enormous scandals of civic corruption began to take over in the nation's papers. Stories about Tammany Hall in New York and the graft prosecutions here in San Francisco, of course, are just a few examples. But rather than outright rejecting these gendered notions that had forced women to remain in the private sphere of the home for so long, many women instead used this argument to their advantage, saying that they could bring morality and righteousness to this depraved world of politics if given the vote. And while implicitly agreeing with these gendered notions may have still been rooted in misogyny, suffragettes were able to win the vote and thus enter the public sphere in a legitimized way. Immediately upon their enfranchisement, California's largest women's clubs began campaigning to pass a number of statewide reforms. The California Federation of Women's Clubs quickly agreed upon a platform that included new testing standards for dairy products, maternity homes for pregnant women, mandated health curriculum in schools, and the list goes on and on. But the law that really became the key rallying point for many of these club women was called the Red Light Abatement and Injunction Act. This law aimed to close down the state's brothels by attacking those that profited off of prostitution, namely the property owners of buildings that were used as brothels. Though prostitution was already technically illegal in much of the state, red light districts still existed. As Alice describes in her own memoir, she was able to find the brothel district in a small California town by asking a local police officer who did not hesitate to point her in the right direction. Club women were horrified by the civic corruption that they believed allowed prostitution to flourish, and the Red Light Abatement Act was designed to circumvent this corruption by directing citizens to file their own public nuisance complaints against the property owners of these buildings. And these club women were not entirely incorrect. It had recently been exposed that Abraham Roof, the political boss of Fremont Older's ire, and Mayor Eugene Schmitz had been bankrolling half of the profits off of one of the most notorious brothels on Jackson near Kearny Street, then nicknamed the Municipal Brothel.
Which could mean more things than one.
But did that necessarily mean that they could destroy the institution of prostitution simply by closing the brothels down? And what would become of the state's prostitutes and dance hall workers? Many of California's legislators argued that this law would simply scatter prostitution throughout the state and out of the confines of these segregated districts. The women's clubs began a fund to create settlement homes for these newly unemployed and evicted sex workers. But as the women of the San Francisco Center of the California Civic League, one of the early iterations of the League of Women Voters, soon discovered was that few, if any, of these sex workers actually agreed to move into these homes. Tonight you can see some of their handwritten reports on display in the library back there after our talk. You can see lists of the names of sex workers that these club women approached. Will you reform? Will you move into these settlement houses? The most consistent and resounding answer was no. Many of these club women based their assumptions about prostitution on these so-called white slavery narratives that really had taken the nation's media by storm. These narratives distilled racism and national anxiety around modernization, portraying sex workers as victims enslaved by depraved pimps or entrapped in a sordid and inescapable underworld, often run by people of color. While many of these stories published in newspapers, pamphlets, and performed on the nation's stages claim to be penned by real sex workers, most have been debunked as entirely falsified. But it was these stories that inspired California's club women to conceive of themselves as the saviors of the enslaved brothel girls. Due to concerted pressure placed on the state legislature by these women's clubs, the Red Light Abatement Act was signed into law in 1913. It was quickly contested and put up for a referendum vote, and as Alice's story was published on the pages of the bulletin, voters considered what was to be done about the prostitution problem, as they called it.
Alice Smith's story, in A Voice from the Underworld, it follows her, in the actual memoir, it follows her from her humble Midwestern upbringing to the shores of the Pacific, where she works at different times as a telephone operator, a domestic servant, a laundry worker, an itinerant farm worker, before turning to freelance prostitution, which eventually leads her into work at various brothels in various towns and cities, and then as a short stint as a madam. Alice's story deals with many controversial topics, such as abortion, police corruption, and interestingly, and I think one of the most fascinating parts of this, of her story, the sphere of female interdependence within the brothel system, the certain protections that the brothel system really did afford these women, and also the fears of street walking and the dangers of street walking as compared to having this brothel system that was a mainstay of the Old West. A Voice from the Underworld itself, it ran 6 days a week over the summer of 1913, causing an unprecedented response in the Bulletin's readers. According to the Bulletin, nearly 4,000 letters were sent into the paper, and nearly 300 were published alongside Alice Smith's story. And this really is what gives this entirety. We publish it in our book, a collection of 12 of these letters. They're all so fascinating. 114 of these letters were penned by other self-proclaimed sex workers, and many by single working-class women, making the Bulletin the primary mouthpiece for sex workers during the Red Light Abatement Act. And really what happened is they were reading the memoir and then responding to the memoir, but then they were also reading each other's letters and then responding to each other's letters, and you really get this fascinating dialogue that started happening between club women, between married women, working-class single women, clergymen, anti-vice vigilantes, and it was very heated. The Bulletin itself wasn't a pro-vice paper, and it wasn't necessarily an anti-vice paper, and it's a little difficult to really pin down the Bulletin. Fremont Older's reputation as an anti-vice crusader is still very much alive, and people have a hard time kind of understanding why he would do this stuff. He's kind of considered to be a kook in some senses, mainly because of, I think, this guy, Walter Bean, who's a very famous California historian. But let's see what the Bulletin says about why they published it. Alice Smith's story and the remarkable letters from women of the underworld which have been printed with it will accomplish several things. One end has been attained already. No open-minded reader of the story and the letters will ever look upon prostitutes as he or she once did, as much victims of our social system as the children who work in southern cotton mills or the exploited who give up their lives in the bowels of a skyscraper's foundations. In a separate editorial, the paper directly criticized the methodology behind top-down, cure-all legislation that fails to adequately address the core issue at hand. The Red Light Abatement Act being criticized in this way as not talking or even really consulting with sex workers themselves. So as the Bulletin wrote, our legislators did not consult the women of the underworld. The women themselves must speak. They must tell their side freely and fully, and their words must be weighed and studied. Otherwise, our best efforts are but experiments. The state legislator had struck at one form of vice, wholly ignorant as to whether the alternative is a worse form of vice. It would build a refuge for women without knowing in the least whether women will flee to that refuge. The legislature is in the position of a doctor who gives his patient a pill without asking a question of the sufferer. The pill might do nothing, or it might cure, or it might kill, or it might stop one sickness and start another. The sensible doctor would first learn the patient's symptoms firsthand. In keeping with what would become a tradition at the Bulletin of memoirs being ghost-written from interviews by newspaper staff, we uncovered evidence that Donald Lowry, if you remember Fremont Older's protege, who he got out of San Quentin, who wrote My Life in Prison in 1912, we discovered that he himself was part of the interviewing process of taking down Alice Smith's story for the ghostwriting, the eventual ghostwriting. Believing that A Voice from the Underworld to be a continuation of the experiment, Older began with the publication of prison memoirs, and not within this family of falsified so-called white slave narratives that choked the nation's media, that were all over the place. We still had no direct proof of who Alice Smith was, or whether she was a composite of more than one woman. Was she a single verifiable woman, or did she in fact exist? In a grand piece of irony, we discovered who Alice Smith was 2 days after our book was published. It's our fault we overlooked this, this research. But it was very exciting. We were at the Bancroft Library, and we were in a little booth, and we were screaming and weeping. Tears of joy and kind of frustration. Our search for Alice is rather complex, and at some point it'd be interesting to talk about it. Not here, though. 2 days after our book was launched, we discovered what we believed to be proof that Alice Smith was a single verifiable person. In the archives of the Bancroft Library, we stumbled upon an important pair of letters that had escaped our notice during our previous research. Ernest Hopkins, who had ghostwritten A Voice from the Underworld from interview notes, wrote to Fremont Older in 1930, 17 years after the serialized publication in the paper of A Voice from the Underworld. Well, Hopkins, it turns out, was down on his luck. He was writing pulp novels for this pulp magazine, and it was the first year of the Depression. He was hoping, he was saying he thought A Voice from the Underworld might be something that was socially relevant, but this undercurrent of the whole time was like, man, this might sell some books, and we're hoping that as well, as a matter of fact. So this is what's interesting. He hoped to publish it in book form, and he wrote to Fremont Older saying, can we publish this? But we know that we need permission from Mabel, as he called her. We're not going to actually, the last name is in there. We feel that the Bulletin took a lot of efforts to hide Mabel's, who she was, and so we're not going to actually release her last name quite as of yet, or we're not sure what we're going to do about that. But it is public record. If you want to go find it in the Fremont Older boxes at the Bancroft Library, you can. But what's also fascinating about this is Hopkins says to Older, another thing we can do is we can restore the original ending. Remember, we had to falsify the ending for political reasons. If Mabel is down for it, why don't we put the real reason how she got out of the life? Fremont Older wrote back. Oh, and he said, and they had a mutual friend, Carl Hoffman, who worked for the Bulletin, had seen her recently. And this is in 1930. Carl Hoffman was still in San Francisco. Fremont Older writes back and says, I didn't write immediately back because I've been trying to find Mabel. He says, I have seen her as recently as a year ago, but I've lost her address. This is where it ends. We don't know what the real ending is. Hopkins escaped into really kind of mediocrity after that, and Older had a lot of other big fights he was fighting for. So anyway, maybe for the second printing, we can tell this story fuller.
That did, in a way, really validate much of our faith in Fremont Older and the research because, of course, as we mentioned, so many of these white slavery narratives were falsified. We had a number of reasons to believe that this perhaps was just another one of these memoirs written in the name of sex workers in order to promote some sort of political agenda by the paper. But part of the faith we had is that there was no real identifiable agenda. And the letters that were published spanned from the most conservative to the most radical, from anarchists demanding, and socialists demanding the collectivization of all land as a solution to the prostitution problem, to, women saying that divorce was the problem and that if women could just stop being so uppity and stick with their husbands, that they wouldn't therefore turn to prostitution. So anyhow, our faith that Alice was a real verifiable person and that the Bulletin had at least based this in the majority of the story in truth has been verified. I'm gonna, the most, a number of issues do start to come into play repeatedly within Alice's story and the letters involved. Most notably, the class issues that separated single working class women from their compatriots. Sorry, I lost my place a bit. We started getting a bit off.
Well, one of the our little dance here. This question of class was something that the bulletin really talked about, and on the other side of the most anti-vice paper, Hearst's own Examiner, really took a very different tack, and it's interesting to see how unique really the bulletin was in this period. The Examiner, their motto in 1913 was "A clean city for clean people." Wow. Thanks, Hearst. And here's a delightful quote from them. "You cannot persuade the right sort of people to come here to San Francisco to live. The clean living people who invest in lands and build homes and foster industries and increase values and swell the volume of legitimate trade, by offering them dirty, mean, repulsive vice as an invitation and inducement to come." Has slightly Trump overtones to me in that. It's a nasty woman. The bulletin, on the other hand, heavily stressed the economic and social roots that created a deeply unfair playing field for women without means who happen to be without a husband, whether through choice or circumstance. Alice she's not the first person when she comes out to the Bay Area to learn that the Bay Area is extremely, extremely expensive if you've never been here before and you move here. That's what she says, and things are, of course they're different now, but as she put it, $6 a week, which was what she was mentioning as her wages, which is the common wages that are told as historians, secondary literature, primary source literature, all throughout the paper. $6 a week was the common wage in San Francisco, and this is what Alice says about that. "I went back to my new $2 room, turned on the light, sat down on the hard bed, and figured things out. I had a sort of feeling as if I was hanging by a thin rope over a volcano. $6 a week. Take out 2 for room rent. That left 4 a week for eating, clothes, car fare, washing, and a good time. Cut out car fare." I should mention, this is before that she turned to prostitution. This is when she was working in a laundry. "Cut out clothes for the present. My old shoes would have to do. Cut out washing. I'll do it myself in my room. Cut out the good time. I'd need that $4 just for eating. Divide it by 7. That meant 60 cents a day, 10 cents for breakfast, 20 for lunch, 30 for supper. That would make 24 a week. I'd be 20 cents short. Well, maybe Sundays I'd go without eating, only 20 cents worth. Maybe someday I'd get a raise in pay. Anyhow, I was free of relatives. That thought brought back that hard, don't care feeling." Another letter that was talking about the unfairness of married women working who are taking wages away from single working class women, which is an interesting letter. She says, "It has been my sad experience that a working woman dependent upon herself cannot compete with girls living at home, and also married women. They work for low wages and they can afford to do so. But a woman alone in this world, forced to work for the same wages, cannot exist, although a member of the Women's Political League considered $6 a week an ample wage. It is easy enough for members of political clubs to suggest such a life on a mere pittance, but to put themselves in such a position, I hardly think they would find their advice practical. I have tried it. Women like Alice and the letter writers faced more than corrupt police and exploitative pimps. They also faced a society, including many middle and upper class women, who either could not or would not accept single working class women as an acceptable social class."
Now, society women were one of the most vocal groups of people talking about prostitution at this time, like I said, with their fight for the Red Light Abatement Act. But throughout Alice's memoir and many of the letters written in, serious questions arise about the charity being offered by the state's club women. While several of the letter writers did plead for assistance from the bulletin's more well-to-do readers, many stirred controversy by outright rejecting offers of help. Alma Green, one of the sex workers whose series of letters electrified the bulletin's readership, admitted that she preferred the life of a self-made escort to that of a society woman's charity case. And Georgia G., another sex worker, wrote, "As far as building a home for us, they will never fill it because there is not a woman among us that will accept it unless we are forced to. We feel that if we do so, there will always be somebody to point the finger of scorn at us, no matter how good we tried to be." Dozens of these letters complain about the serious schisms of understanding between club women, who claim to represent all women of the state of California. This is not surprising when we simply take demographic differences into account. Most club women are notably white, wealthy, educated, married Protestant women, whereas sex workers came from a number of diverse backgrounds. However, most had experienced extreme poverty at one point or another in their lives. But, many were not white. Many were not Protestant, many were not married, but some were, and some were educated. And so when you start reading these letters in the bulletin and the variety of stories coming from these sex workers and how they got into the life and how they felt about it, it becomes very clear why they felt perhaps pigeonholed into this narrative of being victims in need of rescue. There also were certain levels of trust that needed to be overcome because certain groups like the Associated Charities, who purported to offer things like job assistance to sex workers trying to get out of the life, also had perhaps immense requirements that made this assistance inaccessible to many of the women who needed it. One of the letter writers into the bulletin tells a story of how she went to the Associated Charities looking for a job after spending her life from age 15 on as a prostitute, and they asked her for job references. But of course, Fremont Older, and I'll go back here, Fremont Older was not a foe of the club women. He had depended upon their kindness and friendship over his time as a newspaper editor, and it's not that A Voice from the Underworld was written in any antagonism towards them. If there's any sort of goal that we can truly identify of the bulletins, it was to bridge these schisms of understanding through open and public discourse. You can't see it perhaps, but there is a stamp up at the top of Alice's story that says, "This week's installment approved by certain club women of San Francisco," and it's true that they did have a hand in the story. But the letters that often critique the club women, once again, add to the complexity of this dialogue.
Just talk briefly about, in 1917, when the Barbary Coast finally was closed down, Reggie Gamble and Maud Spencer, who are two madams in the Uptown Tenderloin, organized a protest, and it could be very well the first sex worker rights protest in modern U.S. history. And they marched on the church of a man named Paul Smith. They got help writing the speech and organizing through their friend Fremont Older, who they remembered through his work with A Voice from the Underworld in 1913. I just want to read a quick quote from this, from what Reggie Gamble said up in the pulpit. "We women find it impossible to exist on the wages of $6 or $7 a week. Mind you, this is 1917, so things haven't changed between 1917 and 1913, that are paid to women in San Francisco. Most of the girls here present come from the poor. Your sphere is among the well-to-do. These girls are better off in the houses of prostitution than they would be as individuals because at least they get what little protection can be afforded them by the house. Nearly every one of these women is a mother, or everyone has someone depending on her. They are driven into this life by economic conditions. People on the outside seem oblivious to this fact. One of the girls told me that her brother, a Methodist minister, when she applied for help, told her to trust in God. You can't trust in God when shoes are $10 a pair and wages are $6 a week," which I think is an incredible statement. "You want the city cleaned up around your church, but where do you want the women to go? You won't do anything to stop vice by driving us women out of the city to some other city? Has your city and your church a different God, that you drive evil away from your city and your church to other cities and other churches?" And I think this is very relevant for today within homelessness and the cleaning up of the Tenderloin. "If you want to stop prostitution, stop the new girls from coming here. They're coming into it every day. They'll always be coming into it as long as conditions, wages, and education are as they are. You don't do any good by attacking us. Why don't you attack those conditions?"
Now, of course, just in closing, The Barbary Coast was closed down just a few short weeks after this protest. A moral squad of police went block by block through the Barbary Coast and evicted about 1,400 women. There were relief stations set up by club women and other social groups, but one newspaper report says that out of these 14 women, only one showed up at one of these relief stations asking for help, and she certainly seemed to be in some of the most dire and desperate of straits. So while brothels and segregated districts disappeared from the American landscape, of course prostitution continued and still continues to exist, and sex workers have been compelled to navigate new underground networks. The evicted brothel workers of the Barbary Coast had to find and traverse new geographies of sex and police harassment, working as streetwalkers and finding clients in bars, nightclubs, and underground brothels that popped up in new neighborhoods. Anti-vice campaigns in San Francisco have also continued to flourish and fade periodically based on local and national backlashes against vice. And so the questions raised by Alice Smith and the letter writers to the Bulletin in 1913, questions about how we treat sex workers and how we deal with issues of poverty, crime, gender discrimination, and labor, certainly still resonate today. So thank you.
Hi, everybody. So we're going to start with the next set of presentations by Rita and others. So whoever would like to go first can go. And like I said, if you have questions, please put them on the index cards. Raise your hand when they're complete. That's actually going to be the whole discussion portion is fed through your questions. So the more of them, the better. So bring them on. So I will hand them over. So you can sit if you like, or you can come to the podium. Either way.
I'll sit. Well, we're really delighted about this book. I mean, it's a fantastic story, and it actually inspired us when we heard about the 300 to 500 prostitutes going into the church in the Tenderloin in 1917. And we actually did an event on that in 1997. And it was during the time of the Task Force on Prostitution, which some of you remember was set up by the Board of Supervisors and lasted 2 years. And we were on the task force. And when we did that event, we wanted to highlight 2 moments of power for sex workers. The Barbary Coast event when women went into the church, and also the Task Force on Prostitution 80 years later. Now, the task force was a moment when sex workers got to tell our story, just like when they occupied the church in 1917. And it was an amazing moment in San Francisco because the whole country was watching, what happened to the task force. And it was a very deep consultation that went on with the public and with sex workers. And we came up with recommendations to the city of San Francisco. It was actually set up to tackle beatings and violence against sex workers. And we made proposals to the city of San Francisco, broad-based proposals, but we came out in support of the decriminalization of prostitution, and that was in 1998. What was clear in 1917, and what was clear during the task force times, and what is clear now, is that the criminalization of sex work has caused a great crisis for sex workers. The raids against sex workers goes on today. Thousands of women are arrested and jailed. The police, focus mainly on women of color, often targeting immigrant women, black women, and other low-income communities of color. The police, as we know, with the Oakland scandal, abuse their power and take advantage of sex workers. As we know, 30 police around the Bay Area took advantage of a young sex worker, and that was a big scandal. And there's a lot of corruption with the police, and most sex workers don't report violence to the police as a result. The task force pointed out how criminalization makes sex workers vulnerable to violence, all kinds of violence. And some of you may have heard, or you may not have heard, of the case of over 200 black women in Los Angeles, many of them sex workers, who have been either killed or disappeared. And the case, is not well known. It should be well known. We're talking about 200 black women who have been murdered in a serial murder case. And it took decades of organizing by the Black Coalition fighting back serial murders in LA for the police to do anything about this case. And they had labeled the murders NHI, no human involved. We find that there are many similarities between the reasons that women gave during that time of why they went into prostitution. And I have some of the same quotes that you have, because they were so amazing. When the women went into the church and confronted Reverend Smith, it was 300 prostitutes, women at that time, had a whole debate with Reverend Smith in the church. And I'm going to quote again, because the quotes are so fantastic. They said, nearly every one of these women is a mother or has someone depending on her. They are driven into the life by economic conditions. Yet then and today, that's the end of the quote, sex workers' contribution to the survival of families is rarely acknowledged. Another quote, another woman said, women will always be coming into prostitution as long as conditions, wages, and education are what they are. You don't do any good by attacking us. Why don't you attack those conditions? And then just at the end of that was, so Smith said, what would you consider a fair wage? $20 a week, said the women. Why? Statistics show that the heads of the majority of families throughout the country do not make that much, declared Smith. That's why there is prostitution, responded the women. At this point, the reports say that there was a sharp retort. The assembled women cheered and stamped their feet for several minutes. The first, as you said, the first sex worker organizing that we know of. Similar situations are true today. Women are working to supplement low or no wages, pay off debts, student loans, pay bills, and feed families. Research shows that the number of $2 a day households in the US has greatly increased. That is 1 in 25 families. California has 3 million women and girls living in poverty. The Urban Institute just did a study showing that 6.8 million teenagers are food insecure, and that often teens turn to sex work to survive in high poverty communities. USPROS is part of a campaign to get a living wage for mothers and other caregivers as a solution to what to do about the poverty, in this country. The struggle of our sisters in 1917 for justice, just as our struggle today, should be counted as part of the movement against injustice, but it really is. The sex worker rights movement is growing, though, and it's gaining momentum, and we have victories. In California, some of us were involved. We organized a campaign because sex workers could not get compensation for rape. If you got raped or any violence and you went to claim compensation, you were actually denied. There was a specific regulation that denied you compensation for rape. We organized a campaign and won compensation for sex workers. As has been said, the Amnesty International came out in support of decriminalization of prostitution, and New Hampshire, legislators in New Hampshire introduced a bill to decriminalize prostitution. And there are many other prominent organizations besides Amnesty, such as the Human Rights Watch, the World Health Organization, Open Society, Lancet Medical Journal, and others that support decriminalization. So it's definitely on the up and up. And in California, there is a lawsuit, and Rita's going to talk about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for your dedication in making the changes that have been made. It's years and years of effort. And thank you for having us. Thank you for doing the book. This is incredible, and I'm really glad to be here. I am going to end up telling you more about the lawsuit, but I just wanted to start out talking a little more about the issues of displacement during that time period and how it's similar to today. When you look at laws, there's always going to be an intent and a rationale for why the law is made, fortunately. Now, when you look at these laws coming back from 1870, what you'll see is that they're very much targeted at class, status, and there's a strong drive of moralistic element to it. In addition to that, there's a desire to kind of discipline the disobedient worker. And that's all kind of in the code, where things like being a common loafer, common prostitute, common drunkard, all these people are in the vagrancy category, and they're all criminalized by way of status. And around the 1960s, that started changing, and they came up with disorderly conduct. That's because there were actually judgments in court where these laws were thrown out because they were vague, indiscriminate, and subject to abuse. And that was proven, and so the laws were changed. They still had the same intent. So that's kind of what we're dealing with today. And the displacement issue is very interesting and relevant now, not only for like housing issues or places that we may work, such as a brothel or whatever location we may be doing our work out of. There was this Red Light Abatement Act. In addition to that, there's a nuanced version of that. So the weird thing about Red Light Abatement Acts to recognize legally is that there's not a criminal charge. So when you go to defend yourself, you don't actually have the due process of law. An eviction process is totally different. And when the local community creates an ordinance to allow for those kind of evictions, they really intend, it seems at this time, to empower landlords and neighbors to act as vigilantes. And that's totally what's happening now in 2014, just like in 1914. It was instituted by Oakland through our city attorney, and the city quickly passed this ordinance. And we did protest it, but it's still on the books, and we're like monitoring how it's enforced. But currently, the main enforcement is around like pressures, where landlords are pressuring people with the knowledge that they could use that. And the funny thing is, I mean, if it's a residence, you pressure someone out, and now they don't have rent control anymore, and you get somebody in at a new rate. So it's kind of a gentrification scheme and like a land grab scheme. And that's different than back in the early 1900s when some of the men were still making money off of it. Like it wasn't really taxed exactly, but they still had this corrupt means to get profits from it. And now that's not so true. So the landlords have a different motivation to like want to actually get rid of you. So there's that. Also, the government's repeatedly attacked our workplaces in the sense of online spaces. There is something called the Internet Decency Act, which kind of protects a third party so that you can have advertising, and if the advertisers end up having something rotten happen, it's not the fault of the advertiser. I mean, that's part of free speech in our nation. However, the government has gone about all different ways that they configure to get rid of our online spaces. The thing to focus on about displacing us, which I think was relevant in the history and relevant now, is it's like you have to navigate a new space to try to be safe. Your old little space, you figure out little mechanisms for how to be safe, just like in your own lives and your own residence. It's the same kind of thing, and when you gotta find something new and you're a criminal, the idea of this displacement becomes much more dangerous. And I will actually add that it's ironic that what was said in these things, we just protested that Backpage was being basically that will be displaced from another place that we advertise. And one of the protest signs said, address poverty and low wages, stop criminalizing. And I'm like, oh, that's so funny. You know, this is such a theme. So the other thing I really did want to talk about just is our lawsuit, which is, it's about the California law, but it's in federal court. So it's questioning the Constitution, and that's why it can go to federal court. The things it's asking of the Constitution, or saying that it deprives us of, is privacy, livelihood, free speech, and free association. We're suing collectively as like union members for a right to associate, and then 3 individual workers are also suing for their right to livelihood and a disabled client. What we're asking for is called injunctive and declaratory relief, which would basically say, this law is illegal, you can't enforce it anymore. And that relief would be relevant in 9 states now that we're in the Ninth Circuit Court. And it would kind of be, in a way, like the governing law of the land, where like any other case that came about could now use this case law to like say, give more freedom, or to invalidate other laws like this. Another funny thing, you had a picture of a lady like waving to a car, and there's still laws on the books. In fact, Monica Jones in Arizona got caught up with this law that's waving to passersby. So it's kind of like this characterization that you're a prostitute if you're waving to passersby. You should put that slide up again before the end. Like I think that's what that was, is that woman saying like, okay, you pretty much zoned me out of existence. Can I even wave to my actual friends, or will you assume that I'm trying to get a customer? Like, do I have to like, yeah, police my behavior everywhere I go, everything I do? So essentially, I'm super happy to announce about our court case, and the most recent thing that happened to our court case is that we went to the Ninth Circuit level, and we have 36 organizations that did amicus briefs for us. Now, if you're not familiar with those, if you're going to read any legal stuff, those really give like the evidence and the background of the storyline that's happening in court. God, these guys did good. They just put everything, all the dead horses that like all her work and effort that we've been beating and bringing forward this evidence is all in amicus briefs that justices now have to look at, and they're going to be forced to give an opinion. I mean, that's where we're at with that. So I'll just review a couple things that the amicus briefs cover, which are discriminatory policing and the fact that stings are done with male decoys and they arrest more women and more women of color. Additionally, condoms being used as evidence of crime is detrimental to public health. If that's not obvious to people, we have it in an amicus brief, and it will become very obvious when you read all of that evidence. Additionally, another thing that if it's not obvious to people, you make something more dangerous and you deny justice. When we're criminals, we can't report crime because we're accused of crime. That literally happened to me, so I know it's true. Yeah. A violent crime did occur, and you wouldn't believe the lack of action on behalf of the police and the prosecutors and the systems that exist. And I can be proud to say that, we pushed and got a proper prosecution, and even more, got what I hope to be like justice in the form of some financial, what's not actually compensation, it's actually just reimbursement money for funds that you actually extend from being a victim of crime. So it's pretty awesome that change did go through, and it'll be exciting to get the ruling on our court case. I don't really have anything more to say, so I'm going to hand the mic to Ms. Sophia.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Ivy and Devin, for this amazing offering. We're really so excited for this book, and to be here with you both is incredible. And of course, thank you to the California Historical Society for having us. We feel like it's really important to be able to get this message out. And for my part, I'm just going to talk a little bit about sex trafficking. So I'm sure if you all just think about what comes to your mind when you think about sex trafficking? I could guess that it's pretty awful, that it probably involves taking people from one place to another, sometimes without their consent, sometimes having them engage in acts of prostitution without their consent, somebody else making money off of them. And yeah, this is, sex trafficking does exist. It's a terrible thing. The actual legal definition of sex trafficking is the illegal business of recruiting, harboring, transporting, obtaining, or providing a person for the purpose of sex. So we don't agree with sex trafficking. We don't condone it. We are against it. We want it to end globally, of course. But the deeper issue that's happening around sex trafficking and sex work is that the two are being pretty heavily conflated. And the point that I'm wanting to make is that this is propaganda. This is anti-prostitution propaganda. This is pro-prohibition propaganda. And that it directly relates to the white slavery propaganda that was happening during Alice's time that she was talking about. It's not much different. In fact, even President Obama, who I love, recently called this modern day slavery. So even the words that are used today are very similar. Sex trafficking happens. We're not arguing that. It happens far less than the people, than the media would have you believe. The majority of human trafficking in the world is actually for domestic labor, factory work, and agricultural work. These are far more pressing global issues than sex trafficking. Not to say that sex trafficking is not important, but just as far as numbers, these types of labor trafficking are happening much more often than sex trafficking is happening. The sex trafficking propaganda is designed to add sympathy to the prohibition movement, just as the white slavery was. If you feel sorry for us, you want to protect us. And you want to protect us, I'm not sure why this makes sense, but somehow people decide that they'll protect us by making us criminals. That's actually not very helpful to us at all. And some of the biggest proponents of this propaganda are kind of first wave feminists. So we call them sex worker exclusionary radical feminists, SWERF for short. And they, as feminists, somehow believe that we don't have agency, that we aren't able to make these choices for our own lives, which is what the root of feminism is about, is that we have as much choice over what we do in our life as anyone else, as men, I guess, have. So to make a point that we don't have agency is obviously very disempowering to us. And even if we are in poverty, as many sex workers are, we are making the choice of how we earn our money. Sex work is a flexible job. The hours are flexible. We can find childcare. We can go to school. We can do a lot of things. We don't have a boss. It's okay if we don't go to work a certain day. These are all benefits if we're living in poverty than working in a place like McDonald's or Walmart that may not care if we have children or if we need to get them to the doctor or work around our school schedule or a myriad of other things. So yeah, so that's just all important things to remember, that no matter what choices, even if we're on drugs, we have the choice to be on drugs. Even if we're, all these things, we get to make these choices, and making these choices about our own body and about our own lives should never make us criminals. So yeah, who is harmed by this narrative and the trafficking laws? Women living in poverty, women of color, trans women of color, as with any other issue of prohibition, always the ones harmed are those with the least economic resources. Immigrants are harmed by this because the trafficking laws make it easier for them to be deported. Who benefits? One big group of people that benefits are the rescue industry. The rescue industry was funded in the U.S. to the tune of over $500 million last year. These are people who are saving prostitutes. In many cases, they're sweeping them up in stings. They're detaining them. They're not actually arresting them, so they don't have a right to call a lawyer. It's okay to detain them because they're lumping in human trafficking in the U.S. is now lumped in with terrorism. So there's very interesting and problematic and terrifying laws about this happening right now in this country. Then, after all that, after they do these sweeps and try to get these women into diversion programs and things like that, there's no services. There's no social services provided to help these women begin a new life, which many women would like to do. Many of these people would like to do that. And no, they just want to take them off the streets, shame them, show for their numbers that they did something good. But yeah, there's no services provided. And again, poverty is the root issue here. If we're going to look at what to criminalize, let's criminalize poverty. Let's make that the issue that we're working on, not prostitution. I just have a quote for you here. This is Alison Bass, author of Getting Screwed, Sex Workers and the Law. She says, instead of using umbrella term like human or sex trafficking, we need to be more specific. If we're talking about underage sex workers with few other options for survival, we should say that we're talking about underage sex workers with few other options for survival. A discussion that should focus on resources and social service help, not law enforcement. Similarly, if the focus is forced labor conditions, then more attention should be paid to the main industries where that occurs. If the issue is about consensual sex work by adults, then legislators should be honest about using police to harass people for consensual sex work. They shouldn't pretend they're on a noble crusade against trafficking when this is consensual work that's being cracked down on. Finally, we've been talking about sex work a lot. There's a lot of different kinds of sex work. We're talking about adult consensual activity. Sex work is a broad term. It includes any way of making a living off of our erotic labor. That's porn acting, webcam, phone work, dominatrix work, BDSM work, and prostitution. And so when we're talking, obviously, about decriminalizing sex work, we're talking specifically about prostitution because it is the only one of all of those that I mentioned that is illegal. So, yeah, that's all I have. Thank you so much for listening.